So Paul Ryan is exiting stage, probably, I don't know, lobby. He's heading to, I mean, I imagine that's what he's going to be doing. And he is, you know, I have not seen all the stories that are attempting to salvage his legacy quite yet. His press team is probably on it, and they're going to get out there soon. We'll start to see these long lead articles that come out.
Rich Lowry, maybe?
Yeah, I would imagine at the beginning of in January, maybe in the next couple of days, we're going to start seeing magazine pieces about how he was a stalwart. He represented real Republican values. Maybe someday the real Republican Party will come back to him. All of this BS that all these, you know, that he deep down was a never Trumper, but he put the party above his own personal preference. I mean, who knows what kind of sanctimonious crap we're going to hear about this guy. But then there are people who also feel compelled to salvage their legacy, or at least their legacy and how it's wrapped up with Paul Ryan's. Now, let me say this straight up. I think Ezra Klein is a smart guy. And there are pieces that he's written that I've been very impressed with. The one that he just did about YouTubers and about that type of media, I thought was quite good. And there's been stuff over the years that I think I've found that he's done well. But one of the tendencies that he's had that I have witnessed over really, I probably close to my entire professional career, from back when he was, I think, at the American Prospect, and is a tendency that is, and I think, you know, when we talk to Eric Levitz about this, we're going to see it across the board, that is to want to be considered to be a serious thinker, and therefore suspending his disbelief in realms of politics that are about politics. I understand and I appreciate policy analysis, but policy is irrelevant if the policy is being promoted as a fig leaf for something else, or if the policy is being offered in something with less than good faith. There has been so many instances of Paul Ryan. I mean, just off the top of my head, I'm thinking about like his plan for Medicare. And his plan for Medicare was to totally privatize it. But the argument was, well, we're still calling it Medicare. So it's not fundamentally changing Medicare. It's Medicare. But the whole point of Medicare is not the name. The whole point of Medicare is that it is a government-run, sponsored health insurance program. It's not a voucher system. Public school is not taxes taken, the money put into a fund denoted public education, and then handed out to private schools. That's not public school. That's private school funded by the public. That's just one example that comes to my mind, but that is the most classic illustration of Paul Ryan's BS. So Ezra Klein has written a piece at Vox entitled Paul Ryan's Long Con. And in it, he spends the first couple of pages saying Paul Ryan's reputation was built on the back of his budgets. Draconian documents that gutted social spending, privatized Medicare, and showed the Republican Party had embraced the kinds of hard fiscal choices that George Bush had sloughed off. And Ryan presented himself as the wonkish apostle of the new GOP, rolling up his sleeves and running through the charts, graphs, and tables that made his case. And this is about how Ezra Klein says that Paul Ryan never did what he said he was going to do, which was to cut deficits. In fact, deficits grew at a time when we were expanding our economy, and they should have shrunk. And you should know, for the sake of this, that I think Ezra Klein has been fairly consistent in not caring that much about deficits in specific, per se. Certainly, I don't. But Paul Ryan claimed to. Now, in the entire 15 years I've been doing this, starting with George Bush cutting Social Security, there has been near unanimity on the left of understanding that this whole deficit thing was largely about a fig leaf to cut things like Social Security and Medicare so that rich people could have more taxes, and probably to put most Americans in a weaker position when it comes to negotiating with corporations who might hire them. Because if you don't have health insurance, if you don't feel like you have a safety net, right, you are in a weakened power dynamic with anybody you might negotiate with. And Al Gore knew this. That's why he was calling for the lockbox, that thing that he kept getting made fun of. And the lockbox was pretty necessary when George Bush said, well, all there is just IOUs here. There's no money here. Just IOUs, Treasury. Anyways. So Ryan wrote in the book, Young Guns, I admit in recent years, Republicans have abandoned these principles of fiscal conservatism. We've lost the true path and suffered electoral defeats, but we've not returned from this experience empty-handed. For this, Ryan was feted in Washington society. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget gave him a Fiske Award for budget bravery. He was a member of the Simpson-Bowles Commission. He became Mitt Romney's vice president. I was among the reporters who took Ryan's reboot seriously. To move us to surpluses, I wrote of his 2010 proposal, Ryan's budget proposes reforms that are nothing short of violent. Medicare is privatized. Seniors get a voucher to buy private insurance, and the voucher growth is far slower than expected growth of healthcare costs. Medicaid is also privatized. The employer tax exclusion is fully eliminated, replaced by tax credit that grows more slowly than medical costs. I didn't agree with Ryan's policies, but at least he was making the trade-offs of his vision clear. But to critics like New York Times' Paul Krugman, Ryan was an obvious con man, weaponizing the deficit to hamstring Obama's presidency, weaken the recovery, and snooker beltway centrists, eager to champion a reasonable-seeming Republican. Now, this is an interesting rhetorical trick that Ezra Klein performs here, and I don't know if he's aware of it. The way that he refers to himself is, I was one of the reporters who took Ryan's reboot seriously. The way that he refers to Paul Krugman as a critic. He doesn't even say Krugman's name first. He doesn't say Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, was critical of Paul Ryan. He just says, to his critics, like Paul Krugman. Now, what is the rhetorical trick that's being played here? Imagine if I said to you, instead of I was among the reporters who took Ryan's reboot seriously, it would be among his supporters, among his sycophants, among those who were credulous of Ryan, I took his reboot seriously. I mean, you see the rhetorical trick here. The rhetorical trick is that Paul Krugman was inclined to be critical of anyone, and therefore his analysis was just coincidentally right. Now, I may be overstating it a little bit to show this rhetorical trick, but that's the rhetorical trick that's being played here. And then Ezra goes on to say, and his budgets for all the hard choices didn't actually add up. They included massive tax cuts with underestimated costs and unspecified finding, which is what led Krugman to call him a charlatan back in 2010. Ryan had waved this away as nitpicking. Well, But his critics predicted he would lose his appetite for hard choices the moment his party returned to power. He hasn't changed. He has merely rebranded. The numbers proved them right. Ryan was elected Speaker of the House on October 29, 2015. Over the next 3 years, annual deficits increased by almost 80%. Now, and then he goes on to say, to Ryan's supporters, this is unfair. Being Speaker of the House, the most Faustian job in history. But then Ezra says, I think that's too kind. As Speaker, Ryan had tremendous power. He could have done this. He could have brought immigration's compromises to the floor, but he had PAYGO. But he didn't put PAYGO down for tax cuts, et cetera, et cetera. We are the choices we make, and Ryan made his. I took Ryan seriously when he said he was concerned about deficits. I covered the arguments Ryan made, the policies he crafted. I treated them like as he offered a guide to how Republicans would govern. I listened to when Ryan said things like, in Europe, generations of welfare-dependent citizens are hurling Molotov cocktails because their governments can no longer fund their entitlement programs. We can't let that happen here. Now, here's the problem. This story about why Paul Ryan was a con man is interesting, but it's not a huge news flash. Because Paul Krugman was saying this 8 years ago. The interesting story is, why did you take Ryan seriously when he said he was? What is the failure of Ezra Klein, and not just Ezra Klein, but all the other centrist reporters? And I don't know what that means. I don't know what a centrist reporter means.
Credulous.
Credulous reporters. Why were you so credulous when Paul Krugman wasn't? That's the only interesting story here. It's not that Paul Ryan's a con man, because Paul Krugman and others told us that 8 years ago. The interesting story is, why do you, who was at the time one of the premier Washington Post policy analysis people, why were you so credulous? You've told us the numbers didn't add up, and there were other people who knew he was a con man and he wasn't serious. What made you take him so seriously? There is no such thing as policy in a vacuum, particularly when it comes to politicians. Right? Like, I don't even think there's policy in a vacuum at a think tank. But when you're talking about a politician, why is it that the media will be credulous, so credulous, with reams and reams of evidence to the contrary? When it comes to the Iraq War, when it comes to the notion of deficits, I've said on this program many times before that the reason why the press early on was not capable of dealing with the lies that were coming from Donald Trump was because they had not exercised that muscle that made them assess the validity of a claim when it came to Republicans in at least a decade or two. And the chickens have come home to roost. And the bottom line is, we still see it. We still see it. It's irrelevant that you call Paul Ryan a con man now. It's irrelevant because he's leaving office. The time to call a con man is when he's in the midst of conning people. When you say in retrospect he's a con man, that story is boring. The interesting story is, why did the marks, what was it about the marks who are still amongst us, who are still providing us an assessment as to whether we can trust certain politicians, why did they get conned? And that's not in this story.